Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. I'm excited about this episode. We often talk about education and inspiration on the podcast, right? Those are kind of our founding pillars. And this one is all on the inspiration side, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, today's guest is a full-time pharmacist that also has 48 rental units owned with his brother, which I feel like I have to say that really slow, like 48 rental units. Like that for someone that's a full-time pharmacist and also able to do something like that, like to me, that's really impressive, particularly when we talk about how involved he's able to be with that. So just really impressive story of how someone can be that involved in real estate investing without stealing from their full-time job as a pharmacist.
Yeah, so this week we brought on Drew Stahl, a infectious disease and antimicrobial stewardship pharmacist that we connected a little while back, learning more about what he was up to with him and his brother, and just had to have him on the show. I mean, he's been doing this for a couple of years now and really has taken off with the number of units that he has and the way that he handles the business side of it. And so much of it is self-managed, which I think is incredible.
The self-management, I think, is even more impressive when you talk about how he is an infectious disease pharmacist
Right.
in the middle of a pandemic, right? Because that both seem like very time-intensive things. But he goes into really good depth on the self-management, why that makes sense for him versus having a property manager. And even though that may not be a fit for everybody, like that discussion of the why, I feel like is really important so that people can make an informed decision of, do I want to hire a property manager or do I want to try to take on this role myself?
Yeah, and I think he does a great job of talking through how he scaled up. I think what we often miss when we talk to someone like this is, well, all of a sudden they're at 48 units, and it's like, well, I can't figure out how to get there. And so he talks a lot about how they scaled up, what they did from a financing side of things, some of the issues that came up along the way, and just how they managed that. So hopefully you guys enjoy this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. And with that, we'll take you right to it. Hey, Drew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nathan and David. I appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We got connected with you a little while back and just was really impressed with your portfolio and what you've been able to accomplish while still working as a pharmacist. And it just felt like the perfect person to bring on and inspire our audience. So why don't we jump in, talk a little bit about your pharmacy story first?
Sure. That should be easy enough. I'm Drew Stahl. I'm from northeastern Kentucky, so kind of in a triangle around Lexington, Cincinnati area. I went to undergrad at the University of Kentucky, and then I actually met my wife in high school, and we decided we wanted to go to professional school. She went to law school. I went to pharmacy school. So we decided on a city that both of us could get pretty cheap tuition and both of us could get into our respective schools. So we moved to Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to pharmacy school at the University of Arkansas, and she went to law school. Then after that, I completed some postgraduate training in infectious disease. So I have been a pediatric infectious disease pharmacist for the last 5 years and throughout a pandemic, which has been pretty eventful, if you can imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine this must be an eventful season for a infectious disease pharmacist. So with that, I'm curious how you're able to find any time to do anything real estate and kind of what got you into real estate. What has your journey through real estate been like so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. I started real estate. We actually, rewinding to pharmacy school, I actually bought a house prior to pharmacy school that my wife and I lived in Arkansas. So bought a house at 22, just a really small, that was back during the housing crisis. So you're actually getting paid to purchase a house. So I bought a little 3-bed, 2-bath, $100,000 house. The government gave me $8,000. I used that for a ring, proposed to my wife. And then from there, sold that house. That was a primary house. And then when we moved back to Louisville, she kind of got her dream job in Louisville. I was doing kind of what everybody else was doing once they got their pharmacy job. It's like, what am I going to do with the money? I know a lot of people are in stocks. You're doing the 401k, 403b. But to me, stocks just didn't really do it for me. And the more I learned about stocks, the more I kind of saw how rigged, I guess it was. I wish I had a better term or a less negative term for that. But you just see people shorting stocks. And there's just so much to learn and so much that you can lose a lot of value if you don't know what you're doing. To me, it was the decision of an individual stock versus an individual house. For a house, I have control. It's a physical asset. I know where it is. And running the numbers, especially with some of the tax benefits you get from owning a home that is a rental property, you've got someone in there paying down a mortgage that you get. We have really low interest rates. It just made sense to jump into that first one. And once the first one kind of took off, we were able to find a number of other single families just basically through word of mouth. And so for me, the real estate adventure really began from just really not being passionate about the stock market.
It's interesting. And not a lot of people talk about it that way, but I think it's super important that you looked at that and said, this is more risky to me. Like, I understand this far less. It's not a physical thing I can touch. I'm not that interested. And so today you've amassed quite again, pretty impressive portfolio. Maybe give us just a little breakdown of what's included in that portfolio.
Sure. So my brother and I currently have 48 doors as they typically number. We started with only single family. We've gotten into some townhomes in the last couple of years and an apartment complex that's really on the smaller side. We started with just a little 3-bed, 2-bath house that was kind of a fire sale on Zillow. So they listed a little too high and we kind of saw it dropping and we were like, let's pull the trigger and see what happens. It needed quite a bit of work. And so I had a little girl at that time and I was doing most of the work myself. So I would go at night after putting my little girl down and, fix floors or just the little stuff, nothing major. I mean, I don't like to mess with much plumbing or electric. I can fix fixtures or electrical outlets, those sorts of things. But as far as like the big ticket items, I tried to make sure that first one didn't have much. So yeah, that's really where we started. We just found one single family home. We jumped in and it was really exciting because a lot of what I learned from my dad actually had done a lot of work to houses that we owned in the past. And so he had us working on cabinetry and wiring outlets and painting and doing all the little stuff. So flooring, kind of the easy cookie cutter stuff that I could do and I could take to a rental property and add some value.
That's a really impressive growth curve, though, to go from one house to now 48 units across all of that. And I think that process of growth can be really intimidating to folks, especially when they're looking out at the market right now. We're seeing really low inventory, competitive multi-bidding offer situations, like just all kinds of chaos out there in the market. So for you, and particularly when it comes to the single family house, which I think is what a lot of folks are getting into right now, like how do you find a single family house? How do you identify that that's a good deal worth buying? Like how do you move in that direction?
So I guess to tailor that answer to your audience, I would say if I was a pharmacist and I wanted to get invested in real estate, the track that I would take, honestly, is to buy a primary residence that's in an up and coming area that needs a little bit of TLC, do it yourself while you live in it, deed it over to an LLC, possibly refinance it if you have to, and then buy another home that you will live in primarily and put a renter in your old home. That's kind of an easy, low stress transition into real estate. My wife and I actually did that outside of my brother and I. We bought a house in St. Matthews when we first moved to Louisville, just a professional area, very high demand area, but the houses are really small and pretty old and built in like the 1920s, just brick, perfect boxes. And we've seen a lot of appreciation over the time that we've owned that property. But as far as your question of how do you find them after you get to that point, if you want to grow, I am as old school as they get. I shake hands. I'm not afraid to talk to people. Like today, I met a plumber at Home Depot that's going to do some work for us. If I see a situation and talking to multiple real estate agents and investors, I really think you have to be boots on the ground if you want to find those really good properties. Our second property that we bought between my brother and I actually went and knocked on a next door neighbor's door. She was interested in selling. So we sat down in her living room, talked for about an hour. And so I think there's a lot of value to be had to step away from the phone, because those deals that you see a lot of times on your phone, once they hit Zillow, once they hit Realtor, once they hit the MLS, a lot of times those have been looked over by guys like us for, the last 2 weeks, or word of mouth has gone out before they listed. So I think you can get in a lot of trouble if you want to start real estate investing and you hit Zillow automatically. I would say grab a mentor, grab somebody that does it, and then just, if you got to go to Home Depot, if you've got to knock doors, whatever, it does take a lot of work to get that ball rolling. But once your name is out there and once you network with enough people, they will come in a fury, honestly.
It's incredible what happens too when you just start saying, I'm an investor. Even if you haven't bought a single property yet, if you start telling your friends and family, people that you talk to, yeah, I'm an investor in the area, you would be shocked. Like the conversations I've had just throwing that in there. And it sounds like, again, you've done the exact same thing to generate leads, generate business. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, pharmacy, as they always tell us throughout all pharmacy school, is, it's a large group of people, but it's also really small once you get networking. And as soon as you say, this is what I do. Like, for instance, the first house that I mentioned that we bought, we've actually got technician's daughter renting that house from us right now, just because she heard that I had it. She wondered if I had any properties in this area. One came up when her daughter was looking, and she's been in there for 2 years now. So it really is just coordinating and be calculated in what you do and make sure you say it early and often. And it's led to a lot of great opportunities.
I love that. So you mentioned that you're finding these properties kind of off market, but all over the place. Are they mostly turnkey, or are you doing a lot of the rehab work that you described on all of your properties, or what's the typical property look like for you guys?
The best properties as far as single family have been pretty large rehabs, things that I think the bigger groups are not willing to take on just because their return is not there short term. Just to give you an idea, there was a house in Southwest Louisville that we bought for $35,000. We put probably about $30,000 in it. We had to run HVAC in it and take out a wall. I mean, it was a very big project. But I think for your audience, that can get a little bit intimidating if you don't, have a contractor background or know some contacts that can help you with that sort of stuff. So I really think it's just take on as much as you're confident chewing on, because, if you get a big project, you definitely can dig yourself a pretty big hole. But most of our properties are pretty large rehabs. I'd say the first couple were not as big, and we got a little bolder as we went because we saw, there's a little more value that we could generate.
And you mentioned that kind of the quote unquote best properties were those that were requiring that more rehab. Is that just because with the market the way that it is, the ones that are turnkey and ready to go, that lack of risk is already priced in? Is that your perception of that?
I think the other thing is too, to think like you have a bigger audience looking for those already done homes. There are not many single family live-in people that want to deal with, a $20,000 gut job on the front end. A lot of people now, as you guys know, I mean, there's a lot of paycheck to paycheck, and they're just not a lot of people come at a real estate deal with enough capital to put in to make it what they want. And banks honestly aren't very excited to give you the opportunity early on. Now, once you get, to a few, the banks kind of open up a little more and let you take those risks once you've proven yourself that you can take them on. But everything is a balance. I think when you start early on, if you have a construction background, there is no doubt you have a pretty big opportunity to add value and have that thing appreciate before you even get a renter in it. But yeah, we're always looking. It's really a simple calculation. You guys probably have suggested a lot of the books. The 1% rule is what we've used from the start. Just looking at the price of a property. Does it rent in a month for 1% of the value of that property? That's a pretty good litmus test early on. And then if you can get someone in there who knows what they're doing as far as pricing out what you really need to change, what's unsafe about the property, those sorts of things, that's how you can kind of steer yourself in the right direction.
So I love the progression that you're describing there. You're describing this progression of starting off with a little bit simpler rehab and getting increasingly bold over time with more and more rehab. And it sounds like you've done that with the financing side as well. Like you started off with just borrowing enough to do one property, then you're going to borrow a little more to do another property. And so I'm curious how that works, particularly because I'm assuming you don't have 48 standard conventional mortgages on the 48 units. Like you've probably had to get a little creative with that as well. So can you describe the how you finance these purchases?
Yeah, so the first one, we just went conventional. We bought a house that didn't need a whole lot of rehab, and a bank looked at it and said, what you're in for is worth us lending to. But then when you get into those rehab properties, it can definitely get a little bit more challenging because you see the opportunity, but a bank kind of sees a dump. and something that they don't want to invest in. I'd say first property, a single family live-in person, they could have taken that property and easily lived in it. We did a lot of rehab to it to make it a little nicer than maybe it needed to be. The second one, again, it was the same idea. It was a property that, it wasn't run down. It needed floors, it needed paint, but it didn't need plumbing. It didn't need, the whole electrical panel reinstalled or anything crazy like that. And that's something that a bank will be comfortable lending to you, especially if my brother and I have been fortunate to have enough, at least income, that we can justify having, an extra $80,000 mortgage or whatever, the price of that property was. But we're not looking early on with properties that were worth a whole lot. I mean, the first property was in the mid hundreds, which honestly, out of the 10 that we bought, is probably the worst property that we've purchased, just because we were new. We went to Zillow, we found a fire sale. But the second property we bought for mid 60s, third property mid 70s. So we really got a better appreciation for where the market is as far as that 1% rule. And we found properties that were in the 60s and 70s that rented for over $1,000. And that really is how we got the ball rolling. Lenders, they really are built on relationships. Just like we said before, I'm not very intimidated to go ask somebody, what they do for a living and whether or not they want to help us with certain properties. And a lender is the same way. The more you talk to them, the more you engage with them, the more they trust you. You really can build a solid relationship, and then they're more likely to lend to you.
Something you touched on there that I think is super important as well is that you talked about this partnership, right? So you've been investing with your brother on a lot of these deals. So talk to me a little bit about that too, and how that affected maybe the lending or the breakdown of responsibilities that you guys have. Because I think that's something that a lot of people can jive with, right? I've actually purchased a property with my brother. It was a great way to get started and to leverage some of his finances to go with mine. So talk to me a little bit about that partnership.
The good news for a pharmacist, we have 40-hour-a-week jobs for the most part. My brother is an auto dealer, so he works quite a bit, especially around the end of the month, as you can imagine. So he doesn't have a whole lot of time, but he's done very well for himself. He's actually only a year younger than me, so we're really close in age. We know each other extremely well. And the way I say is we definitely approach things differently, but the answer to both of our approaches is always in the middle. So I'm fighting one side, he's fighting the other side. And if we meet in the middle, that's usually where the happy space is. I think the biggest thing with our partnership is just, it goes back to not being intimidated. So being able to tell your partner exactly how you feel about exactly the deal and not holding back on or making concessions that you don't think should be made. It's really has to be a harmonious, especially early on, because there's a lot of stress that's involved. Those first couple of deals, you're putting, blood, sweat, and tears and everything you've earned up to this point into it. And so for our specific partnership, Nate has primarily just been on the financing side, and I've put in the majority of the work just because I have the time to do so. It's going to get interesting now because I think we've built enough equity. Now we're starting to make moves, hopefully trying to get less boots on the ground, but we can talk about that a little later.
Yeah, I love that you built that from trust, right? Because I think it's really difficult. It's really easy, I would say, to find somebody else that's like, yeah, let's invest together. But to make sure that partnership is actually going to work takes a whole different level of trust and understanding. And again, I like that you guys started with that and grew a business from it rather than trying to do it the other way around, because it can be really difficult to go that route.
No doubt. And I think too, while the going is good, the relationship is good. We have been fortunate so far. We've seen properties appreciate through the roof over the time. So we started in 2017. Most of the houses we purchased were from 2017 to 2019. We haven't bought any single family homes during the pandemic. So that relationship, I think, needs to be solidly grounded before you start to hit those turbulence. We still did hit some turbulence for sure, just disagreeing on how certain things should be structured or what we should pay for, what we shouldn't, which tenant we should put in and which one we shouldn't. But ultimately, you definitely have to build it on trust. And luckily, we've had 33 years of knowing who the other person is. So we're pretty fortunate on that regard.
That's awesome. And do you guys have any contracts or agreements in place, like a partnership agreement that you've drafted up? Or is it more just, hey, I promise we'll figure this out, 50-50 split?
We did have, my wife is an attorney, as I mentioned. She drafted some stuff. The number one rule that she kept telling us is not to do business with family. She's just in all of these partnerships that kind of went south. So I've always had that in the back of my mind, and that's allowed me to be even more bold with like, should we do this? Should we do that? But we've also taken, in my opinion, a pretty conservative approach. I mean, even with the amount of houses we've bought, there were 100 deals to one that we passed on that, looking back, might have set us on a different direction, but we had a lot of opportunities early on. And then the pandemic hit, and it was like the numbers just, kind of stopped shaking out as far as what we were looking at.
No, and there's something really wise about passing on deals that you're just not certain about, or just waiting and being patient for that one or two that you have greater confidence in. There's just such good about that. I've seen people get into trouble, and I love that just kind of conservative approach that I think is probably common among pharmacists, right? A little bit more conservative, a little less aggressive.
There is no question about that. I think for your audience, the biggest thing is just to try and get them over the hump to make the move, because as a pharmacist, they're doing all the calculations. They've got spreadsheets, and next thing you know, the deal passes. I think if you feel really good about it and it's hitting those initial numbers, I think you really just have to make the jump, which is definitely the hardest part, because there's a lot of stress to that first jump and you can get overwhelmed very quickly. But just being confident that you calculated the numbers correctly. Pharmacists are going to be the ones that are going to cross the T's and dot the I's. So I have confidence in telling them that they need to be bold.
I like it. You mentioned a minute ago, as you're building equity, you're looking to get less boots on the ground. So I'm curious how you're running your day-to-day operations and where you're trying to get to as far as day-to-day operations.
I will say one benefit, it does sound, and I don't want anyone to be intimidated by the numbers, it does sound crazy to manage the amount of properties that we're managing. I was looking at some property management companies and just looking at the staff they have per door. And I think 50 is about where they have a full-time employee for most of the property management companies I looked at. The good news is you have a phone, you have an email, you have text messages. Everybody's got a phone, everybody's got email. So making sure when you meet that tenant and you outline kind of the expectations. I'm very quick on text messages. And then I also have contractors and people that can fix things day to day. Like the new properties we have that are in Lexington, you just kind of have to build out the people you trust to go in and fix a toilet, the people you trust to go in and fix a shelf. Who is the guy that you put on that job? Who's going to get there quickly? And really prioritizing what you need to get hands on right now versus something that can wait until the weekend when you're off. Our schedule is pretty nice in the fact that we cover some second shifts and some weekends. So about every 2 weeks, I'll have my mornings off on a couple of days, and then I'll have other days off. So if I can stack, like today was a day that I had off. We had a tenant turnover. So I was able to go to the property, rekey the doors, clean up a little bit. Then I know exactly what I need to send people to the 3 things. And it really is just being aware of the next person that's looking to leave and putting in plans to get to that property so that you can take care of the things to move someone else in. We're pretty quick with turnover. I try and get it in a week or two, especially on the houses. Most of the houses are in Louisville where I live. So I can easily, once I put the girls down, go check it out, see what I need to put on, come back. So it hasn't been as stressful as it sounds. With 48 units over the last few months, we've been pretty much redlining at the amount we can take on as far as fixing things and getting to know people and who's going to leave next and those sorts of things. But having a few properties early on, looking back, it seems stressful. But I mean, the 10 houses that we have, actually 11 houses in Louisville, they are fairly easy to manage now, especially because we put in those rehabs. So I know where we stand with the HVAC. I know where we stand with the electricity. There aren't these big projects that we run into when we turn over. Primarily when we turn over, it's touch up the walls. I know the paint color, make sure all of the plumbing is working, and then, get the utilities turned over. And next thing you know, you got a tenant in there in a week. Another fortunate thing is demand has been so high for these properties. You'll get 100 people looking at a property in a couple of days, especially single family. As soon as you list it, the emails just come with a fury. So sorting through those, I've got kind of a system as far as the questions that I send out and the responses that I'm looking for, and then send them an application. You can see, who you want to go after. A lot of times it will somewhat hit you in the face who you want to go with, because the people that really want the property are going to email you multiple times. They're going to fill out the application quickly. There's just some really obvious signs that it's not something you can write on paper. It's more of a feeling that you get from someone, whether or not they really want the property. And then going back to my old school style, once I meet them at the property, shake their hands, look them in the eye, ask them, questions about their previous, you can really get a sense of who you want and who you think is going to take care of that property.
Any systems that you use to help with that? It sounds like, again, you've got a great overall system in place, but any technology that you're leveraging or systems that you have that help to make that process a little bit smoother?
I'm a big fan of Zillow for just short, quick. They have like a $10 a week where you can peruse applications and you can get people to send. And the other thing that I've done through the pandemic is lock boxes that have been really easy to use. So just put a lockbox with a 3-digit code on it and have a tenant if they want to see it. So my stepwise is to basically send them a quick get to know you email. And then they'll outline that. If they want to see it, I will ask for an application and an ID, and then no fees of any kind yet. And then we'll put a lockbox on there. We'll give them the code if they provide their ID. I'll either meet them there or have them check out the house without me if I trust them enough. And then I can easily go after the fact and change that code. We've been really fortunate that demand has stayed so high that when you get 100 applicants, you can get 5 or 6 that you feel really good about, send them. And it's been pretty good pickings as far as the 5 or 6.
Any tips on that tenant screening? I mean, it sounds like you've got some good moves already figured out, but anything that, makes the move in and out process less burden on your time? I love the tip about the lockbox, especially if you've got that trust built in already. I think that's a great way to not send yourself there. But what about, that moment of handing over the keys and getting them all moved in? Are you still doing that manually, or is there something else in place to help with that?
Yeah, for the most part, I'm doing that manually. I'll meet them the day that they move in. I think one of the biggest headaches that you have, depending on the duration of time between one tenant and another, is definitely utilities. Most HVACs in Kentucky are gas. There are not many electric. So, we've run into a couple situations where there was a leak and we tried to put the gas back in my name or back in the next tenant's name. And then there's a leak. So they turn off the gas and it's the middle of winter and you're just like, you've got to spend the next 5-6 hours on the phone with the gas company and a plumber to try and get them there to make sure it gets inspected. So I think the biggest thing is getting in there. It really goes back to shaking hands and looking people in the eye and just boots on the ground, figuring out what you need to fix, because ultimately the less things that you put your eyes on, the more problems you're going to have. It is definitely the most difficult of the things to do. Another, I guess, somewhat benefit of the pandemic, though, has to do with a lot of people have stayed put. So we had a lot of turnover, I guess it was last summer. But as soon as the pandemic hit, we had a year where we had all of our units full and nobody wanted to move. And then people started moving around jobs a little bit. And we had a summer where we had, I believe, 5 of the houses turnover. And that was a little bit intimidating. But at the same time, you can kind of use them off of one another. You're in the same city. So we listed a couple of them. I found good tenants, put one in, and then I've got 3 or 4 other leads for the other one that I know is going to be open in a week. So it's really making sure you save those emails, making sure you save those contacts. A lot of times I will say like first name, which house they're interested in, and just a little blurb of who they are in their contact. So I'll send them, I know we picked someone else for this 2-bed, 1-bath, but I've got this other 2-bed, 1-bath that's going to be ready in a week. It looks fairly similar, fairly same area. So that was beneficial that most of them happened in a couple of months. So we were able to get those filled pretty quickly.
It's those processes and systems to help that not be so burdensome that I feel like can help with that continued momentum, right? Where you can get into this, you don't get discouraged, but instead you see success and you keep going. And you've certainly seen that. You've ironed out great workflow, you've created that momentum, and you've had really solid success in your investing so far. So I'm curious what's next for you and your brother. Where are you planning to go from here?
Yeah, I think the next step, as I referred to, we're at a red line as far as the amount that I can manage, that we can finance, that sort of thing. But if we can get all of these units occupied. We're doing some pretty big rehab in a couple of the new properties that we purchased. If we can get those tenants in and get them solidly placed, feel good about the property, that there aren't many maintenance issues or major maintenance issues, that's when we would probably, the next step would probably be to start a property management company. I really like the idea of finding someone that I trust, that wants to work, that's interested in real estate, and just mentoring them through. So maybe carving off a couple of the houses that I let them manage early on, and then kind of doing the exact same thing that I did here. Now that I trust you with managing a couple of properties. And the reason I want to take that approach is we've definitely found some opportunity in properties that have been poorly managed. So that's primarily the reason that I've taken on so much of this work, is I've seen property managers that have really not treated tenants the best. Or the new townhomes that we bought, one of the tenants told me that they had 54 work orders put in a year, and nobody had talked to them about it. And they weren't major issues, but I went there one day, fixed 3 different things. One was a light, one was an outlet, and one was a toilet that was leaking. And I mean, I'm not one that knows, everything about contracting or electricity or plumbing, but I'm a dad just like you guys are. We have to fix things constantly. And those were basically just dad jobs that I was able to knock out, get some confidence in that tenant. And now, they're going to stay there for a couple more years, and they're really good tenants. So it's just getting an assessment of the tenant and whether or not, those 54 work orders were completely erroneous, which they weren't in that situation. So it really goes back to trust. I want to make sure that the person I have in there is going to deliver news the same way that I deliver it, is going to treat people well, is going to make sure they're not band-aiding things, making sure that you don't create more work by doing the work poorly, I think is probably why I would like to start a property management company.
I love that. Just that desire to do right by the tenant, to do work that you can stand behind, and just create that respectable, safe living environment for someone. I love that.
Yeah, I think the value to me has to be added throughout the whole thing. I think a lot of people see the physical property as the thing you add value to, but you really can add value through relationships, through meeting people, learning, their family. If they're late by 3 days, 1 month, have they paid for the last 2 years? So this is not a big deal. Or is it the second month and you don't really know them? So it really goes back to just good human interactions with people. And I think it goes a long way.
Drew, that's awesome, man. I again really appreciate you coming on the show today. I want to jump now to our final infusion questions. These are 3 questions we ask every guest on the show, and just get your take on these. So the first one is, what's one tangible strategy that you use to make sure that your investing works hand in hand with your career as a pharmacist?
Yeah, I'm definitely a pharmacist first. It's becoming more and more difficult to make sure that sticks. But a lot of the networking that I've done, a lot of the tenants we've put in have been pharmacy related, a couple pharmacy students, a couple pharmacy relatives. The fortunate thing is pharmacy is 7 to 3:30. So if you're willing to spend that extra hour and a half to make it 7 to 5, or work a little bit in the morning. The other thing, we have a schedule that can change every now and then. And so I'll have days off that I'll do a lot of property stuff. You've also got the weekends. And I will say that that's the biggest thing for me with real estate is, are you willing to commit a little extra time to something that, you can have control of investment wise, and possibly make your future a little brighter financially. But you really have to enjoy it too. I mean, I like talking to people. I like fixing property. I like shopping for deals. There's a lot about real estate that I enjoy. So I think if it's a tangible strategy, I think you really have to start with liking it and being interested in it, and then, just make it work around your schedule. Pharmacy, it's a very difficult job to do during the day. There's not a lot of time that I have during the day that I'm able to commit to anything property related, and I wouldn't want to do that with my employer anyways. But again, I get off at 3:30, so I've got a 30-minute commute there, and I've got a 30-minute commute back that I can make phone calls, answer text messages when I wake up. So it is doable, especially when you only have a couple of properties. Early on, when we only had 3 or 4, that's 30 minutes to an hour a day. It's tough when you first get them. So if you can kind of plan, acquiring this property on this day, I need a couple of days off, I think that's probably a good strategy, or I need the weekend off. But it doesn't take as much time, and it's really what you're willing to put in time-wise. You can find people to do it, But again, the more value you can add to it, the quicker you can build a pretty good portfolio.
I love that. It's amazing what time you can find in the day if you actually try. I think it's incredible once you do it. And people are always questioning, like, where do you find the time? How do you pull that off? And like you said, 30 minutes here on your commute, all of a sudden you've got 6 hours a week, at the bare minimum, where you can just jump that right in. So I love that.
Yeah. If I could talk to myself 5 years ago about how stressed out I was time wise with 2 or 3, and now where I am, it's like, Drew, you can do a lot more. I don't know if you can do this much, but you can definitely, this is not as stressful as it is in real time, but it's always tough in real time.
Yeah, and it definitely does get easier. Those first couple properties are definitely the hardest when it comes to that stress and just having never done it before. But as you get more and more experience, it makes it definitely easier.
Yeah, it's certainly the stress of the unknown that drives a lot of that early stuff.
Yeah. So to overcome some of that stress, the unknown, what's one resource that has been most helpful to you in your real estate journey, whether that's a book, podcast, person, author, website, whatever that would be?
I guess I've got a couple. I really like running in my spare time. So I'll get up at 4:30 or 5 and go on, 4-6 mile run, something like that. Just a good way to kind of de-stress before I get, 10 text messages of things that are broken. But so from there, a lot of the motivational guys, David Goggins was a big one early on. That's just kind of like, you can do this, just put your mind to it. Like, you have no idea what a human's capable of. But more recently, I don't know, are you guys familiar with Jordan Peterson? Do you know who Jordan Peterson is? So he wrote a book called 12 Rules for Life. A couple of the rules that I actually have them printed off here that I keep in my office. But one of them is, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedited. So real estate is not something for your audience that they can just jump into and become a millionaire tomorrow. It's something that is at least a decade, maybe even more. I think conventional lenders will tell you got to own a house for 7 years before you really see true appreciation. There's a lot of fees that are built in early on. So you really got to be committed to the long term if you want to start this thing. The other thing that he says, one of his rules is to assume the person that you're listening to knows something that you don't. So you can't go into it thinking you know everything, because you're always going to get a curveball here and there. And you really have to rely on your interactions with plumbers, your interactions with electricians to figure out who you trust, figure out, because there are people that are going to tell you things that you don't need to fix because they want to get paid. There's no doubt that happens all the time. But finding a good group of people that can lead you through, especially a mentor who's done it before, who's a little bit ahead of you, to kind of bounce ideas off. So when you're talking to people, just assume they can at least tell you something about real estate that you haven't read or that you don't know.
It's one of my favorite parts about doing this show, actually, is interviewing guests like yourself. There's always something I don't know, and getting to talk to people like you, I get to learn all that stuff. It's really fun. So number 3, then, what's one piece of advice you'd give to a pharmacist that's contemplating a start in real estate investing?
This is going to be an easy one. Stop contemplating.
I love it.
Yeah,
I love it.
We talked about it before. Pharmacists are very calculated. A lot of them are type A. We're very into finding that minute detail that could throw a patient off or that could change a lab, those sorts of things. Real estate, you definitely have to have a foundation for what you're looking for. You have to have, a little bit of knowledge of where you're going to go. But ultimately, it's just jump into that first one. I mentioned it before. If that's a live-in place that you have, if you could buy a duplex and rent the other side, something that's, not as stressful as buying, a group of properties that you're managing yourself, you can get to that. But I think the best thing is just really stop contemplating the decision, contemplate the deal, and move on the decision once you're ready.
I love it. That's so good. And I love the practical tips about getting started, like buying a place, moving out of that and keeping it as a rental, or buying a duplex, and living in half of it. I love the practical ways to get started. So if people want to reach out and find out more about you, where can people find you?
We mentioned before, I'm pretty old school. I'm not very in tune with social media. I probably should get a little bit more into that. I am on LinkedIn. If you want to message me there, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. If anybody wants some information or wants an idea or wants to throw a deal by me, I'm fine with just some message on LinkedIn probably. If I broaden into social media, I'll let you guys know.
Perfect. Well, Drew, really appreciate you coming on the show today, sharing your message with the audience. Again, really inspiring. So thank you for your time, and look forward to seeing what's next for you guys.
All right. Appreciate it, you guys.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.